My uncle always pretended to be a good guy until I found out what he was hiding from all of us. I told everything to my father, and then, my name is Ethan, and I'm 22 years old. I grew up in what most people would call a perfect family, or at least that's how it seemed from the outside. My father, Daniel, is a brilliant and hardworking man. He built his tech empire from scratch, and because of him, we never wanted for anything. Our house was a sprawling mansion in one of the most exclusive neighborhoods, filled with everything a kid could dream of: an indoor pool, a home theater, even a game room. My mom, Karen, was the perfect wife to match. She always looked put together, knew how to host the best dinner parties, and everyone seemed to love her. She and my dad were the couple, always invited to charity events, always front and center in social circles. And then there was Uncle John, my mom's younger brother. Uncle John was the cool one in the family. You know the type: charming, easygoing, and always good for a laugh. He had the kind of effortless charisma that made everyone adore him. Growing up, I worshipped him. He wasn't married, didn't have kids, and always had some exciting story to share about his travels or the new girl he was dating. He'd show up to family dinners driving a different car each time, sometimes a flashy convertible, sometimes a sleek black motorcycle. He was the fun adult, the one who'd slip me a beer when I turned 18 and let me stay up late watching horror movies when my parents weren't around. But as I got older, I started noticing things. At first, it was just little things I brushed off because who doesn't have quirks, right? My mom and Uncle John were really close, always laughing together and exchanging inside jokes. But that was normal, wasn't it? They were siblings, after all. Still, there were moments that didn't sit right with me, like how my mom would always get this weird, nervous energy whenever Uncle John was coming over, or how they'd be sitting too close on the couch during family movie nights. But I still didn't want to believe there was anything wrong. Not until I found something that shattered my entire view of our family. It was a Sunday afternoon, and I was alone in the house. My dad was away on a business trip, and my mom had gone out for lunch with friends, or at least, that's what she told me. I was bored, flipping through channels on TV, when I realized I needed to text my mom to ask about dinner plans. She always left her phone lying around, and sure enough, I found it on the kitchen counter. I don't know what made me do it. Maybe it was the growing suspicions that had been nagging at the back of my mind. Maybe it was just curiosity. But as soon as I unlocked her phone, there was a message on the screen that stopped me cold. It was from Uncle John. "I miss you already. Last night was incredible. Can't wait until we can sneak away again." I felt like the ground had been ripped out from under me. My first thought was that it had to be some kind of sick joke, but my hands were shaking, and before I even realized what I was doing, I scrolled up through their chat history. What I found was worse than anything I could have imagined. Hundreds of messages, going back over a year. Explicit, intimate messages. Late-night confessions of love. Plans for secret meetings at hotels. The details of their affair were laid bare, right there in front of me. I couldn't believe it. My mom, the perfect wife, the one everyone adored, was having an affair with her own brother. I slammed the phone down on the counter, my heart racing. I didn't know what to do, but I knew I couldn't just keep this to myself. My dad had to know. He deserved to know the truth. But how do you tell your father that your mother has been cheating on him for over a year? How do you even begin to explain something like that? For a moment, I considered not saying anything. Maybe it would be better for everyone if I just kept my mouth shut, pretended I hadn't seen the messages. After all, what if my dad didn't believe me? What if I was wrong, and there was some explanation that made sense, even though I knew deep down that wasn't possible? But then I thought about all the times my dad had gone on business trips, trusting my mom to stay home and take care of the family. I thought about all the dinners we'd had with Uncle John, sitting across from each other at the table while they laughed and exchanged glances. It made me sick to think about. I couldn't let them keep doing this. I couldn't let my dad keep living a lie. I had to tell him. The next day, when my dad came home from his trip, I asked him to sit down. My voice was shaking as I told him everything. About the texts, the affair, the lies. I expected him to blow up, to get angry, to shout. But instead, there was this horrible silence. He didn't say a word, didn't even look at me. He just sat there, staring at the floor, his face turning pale as he listened to every detail I spilled out. When I finally stopped talking, he stood up and walked out of the room without saying a word. I didn't know what he was thinking. I didn't know if he believed me, or if he was planning to confront my mom, or if he was just trying to process it all. The next few days were the longest of my life. My mom acted like everything was normal, completely oblivious to the fact that her secret was out. But my dad was different. He was cold, distant. I could see something building inside him, some kind of storm that was ready to break, but he kept it contained, for now. Then one night, I woke up to the sound of shouting. My father had confronted her. The argument echoed through the house, their voices sharp and angry. My mom was crying, begging for forgiveness, while my dad's voice was full of rage, accusations flying back and forth. I didn't leave my room, but I could hear everything. "I trusted you," my dad yelled. "How could you do this? With him of all people?" I pressed my ear against the door, feeling my heart pound in my chest as my mom sobbed, trying to explain herself. "It was a mistake, Daniel. I didn't mean for it to happen. I love you, not him." But my dad wasn't having any of it. "Pack your things," he said in a low, cold voice. "Get out." The next morning, my mom was gone. The house felt empty without her, but the weight of what had happened lingered in every corner. My dad didn't talk to me about it. He barely even looked at me. But I knew that this wasn't the end. Not by a long shot. Because if there was one thing I knew about my father, it was that he wasn't the kind of man to just let something like this slide. After that night, our lives changed completely. The morning after my dad kicked my mom out, the house felt like a different place. The air was thick with tension, as though the walls themselves knew something was broken that couldn't be fixed. I thought maybe things would calm down after my mom left, that my dad would start to heal, and we could try to move on, even though nothing would ever be the same. But I underestimated just how deep my father's anger ran. The day after she was gone, my father, Daniel, took action. He wasn't the kind of man to let emotions control him. He was calculating, always in control. I remember seeing him sitting at the kitchen table, scrolling through his phone with a kind of cold focus I had never seen before. I asked him what he was doing, but he just looked at me, his face completely unreadable, and said, "Don't worry about it, Ethan. I'm handling it." And he was. He was handling it in a way only he could. I didn't know at the time, but he had hired a private investigator to dig deeper into Uncle John's life. My father wasn't content with just kicking my mom out. He needed to know everything, every single lie that had been told to him. A part of me hoped the affair with my mom was the only secret. As painful as that was, it seemed like the worst thing Uncle John could have done. But it wasn't. The investigator worked fast. In less than a week, my father had a full report on Uncle John's life, everything from his finances to his personal relationships. And what he found shocked even me. As it turned out, the affair with my mom wasn't John's only betrayal. He had been living a double life for years. Apparently, Uncle John had been involved with another woman, a long-term girlfriend who lived in a different part of the city. He had been seeing her for almost 3 years, leading a completely separate life from the one we knew. He even had a second home, a small apartment where he would spend weekends with this woman, all while pretending to be the fun, carefree uncle with us. When my dad told me about it, I could hardly believe it. The man I had idolized growing up, the one who had always seemed so easygoing and full of life, had been lying to all of us. He was juggling relationships, keeping secrets, and manipulating everyone around him. It made me sick to think about how I had looked up to him for so long. And now, it was all crashing down. My father, though, didn't show any emotion when he told me about John's double life. He was calm, too calm, like he was discussing a business deal instead of the destruction of our family. But I knew him well enough to see that beneath that cold exterior, he was boiling with rage. "He's going to pay for this," my dad said quietly, his voice steady but dangerous. "I'm going to make sure of it." And he meant it. My mom, Karen, tried to reach out to me a few days after she left, but I didn't know how to talk to her. What could I even say? She had destroyed everything. Still, part of me wanted to understand why she had done it. So when she texted me, asking to meet, I agreed, even though I didn't want to. We met at a small cafe on the other side of town, away from the prying eyes of our social circle. She looked different, tired. Her makeup couldn't hide the dark circles under her eyes, and her hands trembled as she picked at the edge of her coffee cup. I could tell she had been crying, and for a second, I felt a pang of sympathy for her. But then I remembered what she had done. "Ethan, I'm so sorry," she said as soon as we sat down. "I never meant for any of this to happen." "Then why did it?" I asked, my voice cold. "Why did you do it, Mom? With Uncle John, of all people?" She stared down at the table, her eyes filling with tears. It just happened. I wasn't happy with your father. We were growing apart, and John was there for me. It was a mistake. I know that now." "A mistake?" I couldn't help the anger rising in my chest. "A mistake is something you do once, not for a whole year. Do you even hear yourself right now?" She flinched, and for a moment, I almost felt bad. Almost. "I know you hate me," she whispered, wiping her eyes. "And I don't blame you. But I want you to understand that I love you, Ethan. You and your father mean everything to me." "Then why did you destroy everything?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. She didn't have an answer. We sat in silence for a long time after that, and eventually, I just got up and left. I didn't know if I could ever forgive her, but at that moment, I knew I wasn't ready to even try. Meanwhile, my father's plan for revenge was already in motion. He had confirmed the affair with the investigator, and now he was going after Uncle John's business. John had built a successful chain of high-end restaurants in the city. They were trendy, popular spots where people went to be seen, and for a long time, John had been riding high on the success. But what most people didn't know was that several of his key investors were tied to my father's company, and all it took was a few calls from my dad for those investors to pull out. Within a matter of days, Uncle John's business was in free fall. He tried to save it, scrambling to secure new investors, but no one wanted to touch his restaurants after the scandal of the affair leaked to the press. My father made sure of that. He had connections in the media, and before long, articles started popping up about John's personal life. It was all out in the open. His affair with my mom, the other woman, his double life. The public loved the drama, and soon, John was a pariah. No one wanted to be associated with him. I heard from some friends that Uncle John's restaurants were closing down one by one. He was losing everything. But my dad wasn't done yet. He turned his attention to my mom, suing her for everything. They had a prenuptial agreement, so she wasn't entitled to much, but that didn't stop him from going after every penny she had. She had some savings, investments she had built over the years, but my father made sure she lost all of it. He was ruthless in court, dragging out the divorce proceedings and leaving her with nothing. It was brutal to watch. As angry as I was at my mom and Uncle John, seeing them both completely destroyed like this was hard. There were moments when I wondered if it had all gone too far, if maybe we could have found some way to heal without so much devastation. But then I remembered the betrayal, and any sympathy I might have had disappeared. By the time my father was done, my mom was living in a small apartment downtown, far from the life of luxury she had once known. And Uncle John? His reputation was ruined, his business in shambles. He had disappeared from the city, and I didn't know where he had gone. All I knew was that my father had made good on his promise. Uncle John had paid for what he'd done, but as I watched everything unfold, a part of me couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't the end. My dad had gotten his revenge, but at what cost? Our family was shattered, and things would never be the same again. If I thought my father's revenge had been swift before, it was nothing compared to what came next. Once he got started, it was like he couldn't stop, and Uncle John became his sole focus. My mom had already been stripped of everything. Her money, her reputation, and, more painfully for her, her family. But for my dad, Karen wasn't the real target. John was. And Daniel wasn't going to rest until my uncle was utterly destroyed. The first thing my dad did was continue the attack on John's business. The investors had already pulled out thanks to my father's connections, but my dad didn't stop there. He made sure to reach out to the few remaining partners John had, subtly letting them know that continuing any association with my uncle would be bad for their careers, reputations, and, most importantly, their wallets. In the business world, that's all it takes. A word here, a warning there, and suddenly John's restaurants couldn't catch a break. First, suppliers started charging more or backing out of contracts altogether. Then, Key employees began quitting, either because they didn't want to be associated with a man whose name was being dragged through the mud, or because they could see the writing on the wall. The collapse was coming, and it was coming fast. Uncle John tried to fight back. He tried rebranding one of his restaurants, but it was too little, too late. The media got wind of everything, and soon enough, the story of his affair with my mom and his double life was splashed across every gossip blog and tabloid. My father made sure of that. He had friends in the right places, and those friends knew how to make sure the scandal stayed in the public eye for as long as possible. The articles weren't just about the affair. They painted John as a morally bankrupt, sleazy businessman who had no loyalty to his family or his partners. His restaurants emptied out. Nobody wanted to be seen dining at a place owned by a man who had become a public villain. It wasn't just about the food anymore. It was about reputation. And in a city like ours, reputation is everything. I remember sitting in the kitchen with my dad one morning, watching him as he read through a series of emails on his phone. His face was calm, unreadable, but I knew what was going on behind those eyes. He was systematically taking apart Uncle John's life, piece by piece, and the satisfaction of it was chilling. I wanted to talk to him about it, to ask him if it had all gone too far, but I didn't know how to bring it up. I didn't know if I had the right to. Because, deep down, I knew that this whole mess had started because of me. I was the one who found the messages. I was the one who told my father. And now, John's life was being destroyed, not just by my dad's actions, but by the ripple effect of what I had uncovered. But it didn't stop with the restaurants. That wasn't enough for my dad. He wanted Uncle John to feel every ounce of pain he had caused, and he wasn't satisfied with just taking away his business. One night, I overheard my dad on the phone, speaking in a low, measured tone. He was talking to his lawyers, instructing them to dig into John's finances. My dad had connections everywhere, and if there was anything shady in John's business dealings, he was going to find it. I wasn't sure what he was looking for, but I knew my dad well enough to understand that if there was something to be uncovered, he'd find it. It didn't take long. A few weeks later, my dad called me into his office. I could tell from the look on his face that something had changed. He wasn't angry anymore. If anything, he looked almost satisfied. "We've got him," he said, handing me a stack of papers. "John's been funneling money from his restaurants into off-the-books accounts. Tax evasion, fraud, the works." I stared at the documents in disbelief. "Are you serious?" "Dead serious," my dad replied, his voice cold. "I'm taking this to the authorities. He's not just going to lose his business, he's going to jail." And that's exactly what happened. My father handed over everything to the investigators, and soon enough, Uncle John was facing criminal charges. The headlines were worse than ever. It wasn't just about his personal scandals anymore. Now he was a criminal. The authorities froze his assets, and his restaurants were shut down entirely. Everything he had built was gone, and he had no one to blame but himself. Or at least, that's what I told myself to justify it. By that point, the guilt had started to eat away at me. I knew John had done awful things. He had betrayed my dad, lied to us all, and cheated on his own family. But did he really deserve to be utterly destroyed like this? Did he deserve to lose everything, to be left with nothing? My father didn't seem to care. As far as he was concerned, John had crossed a line, and there was no coming back from that. But for me, it wasn't that simple. I couldn't help but feel like I was responsible for all of it. I had been the one who set the ball rolling. If I hadn't found those messages, if I hadn't told my father, would any of this have happened? Sure, my parents' marriage would have fallen apart eventually, but would John's life have been ruined so completely? One night, after everything had started to unravel for John, I went for a drive to clear my head. I ended up outside one of John's old restaurants, the flagship one, the one where he had started his empire. The windows were dark, the doors locked, and a sign in the window read, "Closed for business." It was eerie to see it like that, knowing that just a few months ago, this place had been full of life, full of people who had no idea what kind of man John really was. I parked the car and just sat there for a while, staring at the building. I thought about all the family dinners we had had here, all the times I had looked up to Uncle John and admired him for being so successful, so cool, so different from my dad. And now, he was nothing. Just a man whose life had been torn apart by his own actions and by mine. I didn't see or hear much from John after the charges were filed. He disappeared from our lives completely, which wasn't surprising given everything that had happened. My father had made sure that John would never be able to show his face in our circles again. He had taken everything from him, just like he had taken everything from my mom. Speaking of my mom, she had tried to rebuild her life in the wake of the divorce, but my father's lawyers were relentless. They dragged out the proceedings, leaving her with nothing but a small apartment and a broken reputation. She still called me occasionally, trying to talk, but I wasn't ready to hear her out. I couldn't look at her without thinking about how she had betrayed us. Maybe that was unfair, but I couldn't help it. As the weeks went by, I found myself questioning more and more if any of this had been worth it. Sure, John and my mom had done horrible things, but was the total destruction of their lives really the right answer? My dad seemed to think so. He was more focused than ever on his work, and we barely talked anymore. It was like the entire situation had turned him into someone else, colder, more distant, more consumed by the need for control and power. And me? I was left wondering if I had made the right choice by opening Pandora's box in the first place. I thought it was over. I thought once Uncle John's life crumbled and my mom had been stripped of everything, that the nightmare would finally end. But that was naive. As the dust began to settle, I started to realize that the damage done to my family wasn't just emotional. It was something deeper, more sinister. What we'd uncovered about John's affair was just the tip of the iceberg. Weeks had passed since Uncle John had been dragged through the mud publicly and my mom had vanished from our lives. My father, Daniel, seemed to be moving on, focusing on work more than ever. But there was a coldness in him now that I couldn't ignore. It was like a switch had flipped inside him, and he wasn't the man I remembered. He hardly spoke to me, barely looked at me. It was as if his entire existence had been reduced to one thing: revenge. One evening, I decided to go through some of my mom's old things. She had left behind a few boxes in the attic, filled with papers and personal items that I hadn't touched since she left. I don't know why I felt the need to dig through them. Maybe I was looking for some kind of closure. Maybe I just wanted to understand why everything had fallen apart the way it did. As I sifted through her belongings, I found an old folder stuffed between family photos and notebooks. The folder was labeled with John's name, and it immediately piqued my curiosity. Why would my mom have something like this tucked away? I opened it and began leafing through the contents: business documents, bank statements, and legal papers. At first glance, it didn't seem like anything out of the ordinary. But then, as I started to read more carefully, something jumped out at me. There were transactions in there that didn't make sense. Large sums of money being transferred from accounts that were linked to my dad's company into offshore accounts that seemed to be tied to Uncle John's businesses. At first, I thought it had to be a mistake. But as I read further, the pattern became clear. John hadn't just been using his own funds to run his restaurants. He had been siphoning money from our family's wealth for years, moving it into shady accounts to fund his various business ventures. My heart pounded in my chest as I realized what this meant. John hadn't just betrayed us with his affair. He had been stealing from us, too. I could barely breathe as the pieces started falling into place. No wonder John had been able to expand his restaurants so quickly. No wonder he always seemed to have cash to burn. He had been using my father's money, without his knowledge, to fund his entire empire. I didn't know what to do. I sat there in the attic, staring at the papers in disbelief. Part of me wanted to pretend I hadn't seen any of it. I didn't want to stir the pot any more than I already had. But I knew that I couldn't hide this from my dad. He had a right to know. And I also knew that when he found out, things would only get worse. I told him the next day. I waited until we were both home, sitting in the kitchen, and handed him the folder without saying a word. He flipped through the papers, his expression unreadable at first. But as he reached the bank statements, I saw the familiar look of cold fury creeping across his face. "He's been stealing from us," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. My dad didn't respond at first. He just stared at the documents, his jaw clenched tight. When he finally spoke, his voice was so calm it sent a chill down my spine. "I should have known," he muttered. "I should have known that bastard wasn't finished." And just like that, the calm that had started to settle over our lives evaporated. My dad didn't waste any time. Within hours, he had contacted his lawyers and investigators, launching a full-scale investigation into John's finances. What I had found in that folder was just the beginning. My dad's team started digging deeper, going through years of financial records, bank accounts, and business transactions. And what they uncovered was even worse than I could have imagined. Uncle John hadn't just been using my dad's money to fund his restaurant empire. He had been involved in all kinds of shady deals. There were illegal loans, shell companies, and money laundering schemes that stretched across multiple states. John had built his entire business on a foundation of lies and fraud, and now it was all coming to light. When the authorities were finally brought in, Uncle John's fate was sealed. He was already facing criminal charges for tax evasion, but this new evidence added a whole new level of corruption to the case. The media caught wind of the investigation, and soon, headlines about John's financial crimes were everywhere. He was painted as a mastermind of corporate fraud, a man who had not only betrayed his own family but had also broken the law at every turn. I remember the day my dad told me that John had been arrested. He sat across from me in the living room, his face hard as stone. "They're going to put him away for a long time," he said, his voice flat. I didn't know how to respond. Part of me was relieved. Uncle John had gotten what he deserved. But another part of me felt sick. Everything was spiraling out of control, and it seemed like there was no way to stop it. My family had been torn apart, and now John was going to prison. Was this really what justice looked like? Was this really what we had been fighting for? As the weeks passed, the tension in our family only grew. My mom, who had been trying to stay under the radar, reached out to me again, asking for a chance to talk. I hadn't spoken to her since our last meeting at the cafe, and I wasn't sure I was ready to face her. But something in her voice made me agree to meet. We sat down at a park bench one chilly afternoon. She looked worse than the last time I'd seen her, thinner, more tired. It was clear that the divorce had taken a toll on her, but I couldn't forget the role she had played in all of this. "I know you probably hate me," she said quietly, not meeting my eyes. "And I don't blame you. But I need you to know that I never wanted this. I never wanted any of this to happen." I didn't say anything. I just listened, letting her words wash over me. "Your father, he's not the same man anymore," she continued. "I know I'm the one who destroyed our marriage, but he's gone too far, Ethan. He's consumed by this need for revenge, and I'm worried about what it's doing to him." I frowned, unsure of how to respond. My father had always been intense, but lately, he had become someone I barely recognized. The man who had once been focused on building a life for our family was now fixated on tearing someone else's life apart. It scared me, even if I didn't want to admit it. "Maybe you're right," I said slowly. "But you brought this on yourself. You brought it on all of us." She nodded, tears filling her eyes. "I know, and I'm sorry. I'm so sorry, Ethan." Everything came crashing down, just as we expected it would. Uncle John's downfall was swift and brutal. The financial crimes stacked up, and his arrest turned into a high-profile trial. The media fed on the scandal like vultures, documenting every twist and turn, each new revelation about his shady dealings more damning than the last. What little remained of his reputation was ground into dust. He was found guilty of fraud, money laundering, and tax evasion, charges that all but guaranteed a lengthy prison sentence. His assets were seized, his businesses shut down, and he was left bankrupt, with nothing to show for the empire he'd spent years building. The man who had once been the life of every party, who had made people laugh and feel at ease, was now just a shell, broken and humiliated. His face, once familiar and full of charm, became a symbol of disgrace in every headline, and the family we had been, wealthy, respected, envied, was now notorious for all the wrong reasons. My mom, Karen, wasn't much better off. Isolated and without any of the financial security she had grown accustomed to, she moved into a small apartment far from the social circles she once thrived in. She tried, repeatedly, to reconcile with me. She called, texted, even showed up at the house once, begging for a chance to explain herself again. But I couldn't do it. I couldn't face her, knowing what she had done, knowing how her betrayal had been the spark that lit the fuse of our destruction. Every time I looked at her, All I could see was the web of lies she had spun and the wreckage of our family scattered around us. And maybe, deep down, I was afraid that if I let her back into my life, I'd have to face the part one had played in all of this. One day, she left a voicemail saying she missed me, saying that she understood if I hated her, but that she still loved me and would always be there if I wanted to talk. I never called her back. My father, Daniel, changed the most. The man who had once been so full of drive and ambition now seemed hollow, consumed by his thirst for revenge. At first, I thought his focus on bringing Uncle John down was a way for him to cope, a way to regain control after being so deeply betrayed. But as John's life unraveled and the legal battles were won, my dad didn't seem satisfied. He wasn't relieved, he wasn't happy. It was as if there was nothing left in him except cold determination. He started spending more and more time at work, locking himself away in his office late into the night. We barely spoke anymore. When we did, our conversations were short and tense. He didn't seem interested in anything I had to say, and even when I tried to bring up something other than the fallout from John's crimes, he would brush me off. It was like he couldn't see anything beyond the destruction he had wrought, and he didn't know how to be a father to me anymore. One night, I tried to talk to him about it, about how different things had become between us. I told him how lonely the house felt, how much I missed the way we used to be, even before the affair. I didn't know if we could ever go back to the way things were, but I was desperate to try. "You don't understand, Ethan," he said, his voice cold and distant. "This had to happen. They deserved everything they got. Your uncle betrayed us. Your mother, she ruined this family. I'm just cleaning up the mess they made. But what about us?" I asked, my voice breaking. "What about you and me? What's left after all of this?" He didn't answer me. He just turned away, leaving me standing there in the doorway of his office, feeling like I had lost him, too. I started spending more time outside of the house after that, trying to escape the suffocating tension that seemed to hang over everything. I couldn't stand being there, watching my dad become someone I barely recognized, knowing that the family I had once loved was gone for good. Sometimes, when I was alone, I thought back to that day when I found the messages on my mom's phone. I had been so sure I was doing the right thing, so convinced that telling my father the truth was the only option. But now I wasn't so sure. Had I done the right thing by telling him? Or had I simply opened the door to a level of destruction that no one could have predicted? My decision had set off a chain reaction. My mom's affair had been the first betrayal, but what followed was a total unraveling of everything we had ever known. My father had lost himself in his need for revenge. My mother had lost everything, and Uncle John was facing years in prison. And me? I was left standing in the ruins, wondering if it was all worth it. I used to believe that the truth was the most important thing, that exposing lies and deception would somehow make things better in the end. But now, with my family shattered and my father barely speaking to me, I wasn't so sure anymore. The truth hadn't set us free. It had destroyed us. In the end, I wasn't sure who I was anymore, or what my place was in this broken family. My father was too far gone in his quest for revenge. My mother had been banished from our lives, and Uncle John's fate was sealed. And me? I was just alone. Maybe the truth had to come out. Maybe there was no other way this could have gone. But standing there, in the wreckage of the life we had once had, I couldn't help but wonder if keeping the secret would have been easier. Would we still be a family, however flawed, if I had just turned a blind eye? Would my father still be the man I used to admire? Would my mother still be someone I could love, despite her flaws? I guess I'll never know. All I do know is that the price of truth was higher than I ever imagined, and I'll be paying that price for the rest of my life. If you like this story, subscribe right away and listen to new stories every day. Let us know what you like the most in the comments.